Now friends, we can discuss or we will discuss the another important issues related to the implementation or the formulation of foreign policy or the foreign policy in world politics. That is the theoretical explanation how the international theorists or the international approaches look at the issue of foreign policy formulation and implementation in world politics. So in that sense friends, there are four important approaches that we can with the help of that we can understand the conception of foreign policy formulation as well as the implementations, what are the actors involved in that, how the foreign policy is influences by these factors, the factors that is happening in the domestic sphere as well as in the external sphere. So in that sense friends, we have the realistic perspective of the explanation of the issue of foreign policy in world politics. As we know friends, the realistic approach talks about that the international system is based on the anarchical system, which means that the state are the main actors in the international system and the state interest is in conflict with the other state in the international system. So because of the selfish behavior of the state and that based on the concept of zero sum game, there is a kind of conflicting situation, and it is also happening because there is no any common agencies or any super agencies that can control the selfish nature or behavior of the state in the international system. And because of that reason, state wants to enhance their national power just to achieve the national interest in that particular international system, which is based on anarchy. So in that sense friends, the foreign policy of any actors from the perspective of realistic approach to international relation or realistic perspective to foreign policy making, that the state would not believe in the cooperative aspect of the engagement of the state in the international system. Rather, the state would behave in the enhancement of their national power. So in the making of foreign policy, that will reflect in the making of the foreign policy the basic realities or the basic assumptions of the realistic approach to foreign policy making or the realistic approach to international relations. So that cooperative engagement is not possible in the foreign policy making. In the strategies or the means of the foreign policy used by the state would be more based on the conflicting perception of the international system, and the enhancements of the political power is the main means to achieve the national interest, that is the security of the nations, sovereignty of the nations, and also the survival and the economic development of the nation. Another important aspect or the approach of foreign policy is the liberal perspective. So as we know friend, that the liberal approach is also having the faith in the state as a main actors in the international system, but they are arguing that anarchy can be avoided and cooperations can be achieved, or cooperation is possible among the state in the international system if the state would follow or having the faith in the international organization and international law. So through these kind of institutions like the international organization and also having faith in international law, to achieve the common objective, that is the mutual goal, mutual understanding and mutual cooperation is possible. So while the state is making any sort of foreign policy in the international system from the perspective of liberal approach to international relations or world politics, the state would behave in a cooperative manner. The foreign policy would be designed that will reflect the cooperative aspect of the state in the international system, and the state would follow the basic norms and procedure of the international law and international organizations as well. So that liberal perspective of the new liberal perspective, where the economic institutions are very much important so far as to engage economically the state in the international system. So that aspect of the realistic or the liberal or the new liberal approach to international relations also impacting the foreign policy, or with that perspective we can analyze the state behavior and the state foreign policy vis-a-vis to international system is concerned. Another important approach in international relations that also decide or that also help in explaining the basic characteristics of the foreign policy formulation in world politics is the constructive perspective to look at the foreign policy of a particular state. So in that sense, friends, as we know that the constructive approach is more talking about the basic the culture, belief, orientations of the state. The policy makers are impacted by the belief and by the idea and by the cultural aspect as well, and that culture, idea, the preferences of the policy makers are not in according to some other factors, rather their idea, their preferences is impacted by the social surrounding, the social belief and the social and the ideas which prevail in the society, and that is constructed by the major powers in the international system. But the state has to follow, state is following that sort of policies vis-a-vis making of the foreign policy regarding the international system. So in that perspective, friends, we can say that the policy makers, while making any sort of foreign policy, they are actually influenced by the various norms, various beliefs, various ideas that prevail in the international system. So that foreign policy making by the policy makers are actually influenced by these sort of ideas, and that is the constructive approach or constructive perspective to look at the concept of or the issue of foreign policy in the world politics. Another important way or another important approach that we can make out to explain the issue of foreign policy in world politics is the issue of non-state actor or the perspective of non-state actors perspective. So friends, as we know that the realistic approach, liberal approach or the constructive approach, they are talking about the state as a main agency, or the state are the main actors in the international system. These actors are actually implementing the foreign policy, and also they are the actors, they are actually formulating the foreign policy. But unlike that, in the from the non-state perspective of foreign policy is concerned, it is not only the state that are the important actors, rather there are various other non-state actors as well. For example, international organizations like League of Nations, United Nations, BRICS, ASEAN, and like other similar sort of international and regional organizations. In addition to that, there are various civil society groups as well at the international level that we call as the global civil society, international non-governmental organizations that also is playing a very important role, and it is also these organizations also influencing the foreign policy making of that particular state as well. How that these organizations, non-state actors, international organizations, regional organizations, international non-governmental organizations, civil society groups, think tanks, how these sort of non-state actors are now actually playing a very important role, and in a way it impacting the foreign policy making and implementation of a particular state in the international system. So friends, in that sense we can say that it is not a bilateral kind of foreign policy or diplomacy, rather it is a multiple foreign policy making or the multilateral kind of foreign policy making and implementation in world politics. So these are the important theoretical explanation or the theories or the approaches of the international relations, how that also influencing or impacting or rather helping us to understand or to analyze the foreign policy making in world politics. Friends, from that perspective, in addition to that, another important things that we have in the study or in the discussion over the foreign policy in world politics is concerned, the issue of foreign policy analysis. In that, friends, the various models, the various approaches more specifically the various models that we have to explain the concept of foreign policy in world politics or the issue of foreign policy in world politics. So the foreign policy analysis is basically referring which are the actors involved in the formulation of foreign policy and implementation of the foreign policy, what are the basic objective of the national interest, how that foreign policy are implemented, means the various means that applied in the discourse or in the course of implementation and formulation of foreign policy by the state. So in that, friends, there are various models in the foreign policy analysis or the assessment. There are various models that help us to understand the issue of foreign policy in the domain of world politics. So friends, in that regard, we can refer one of the important models to understand or to understand or explain the issue of foreign policy in world politics is the traditional approach or traditional models of foreign policy. Similarly, we also have the analytical approach, ideological approach, comparative approach, bureaucratic structure and process approach, cognitive process and psychological approach, and lastly the social constructive approach. These are the approach, as well as we also can say that these are the various models through that we can understand, we can explain the basic issue which are related to foreign policy formulation and foreign policy implementation. Friends, we can understand that the traditional approach in a way that the traditional approach or the traditional model of foreign policy is that which are the actors are basically involved in the making of foreign policy, what are their preferences in the making of foreign policy. So, the actors, the institutions and their preferences, which means that the national interest, these are the issues that are very important in the study of foreign policy. So, this traditional approach or the traditional models is actually referring the various institutions involved, what are the basic issues which are identified in the course of identification of the national interest of that particular nation is concerned. So, the issue of national interest, the issue of the objective of the national interest, and also the various actors or the policy makers engaged in the making of foreign policy, that is the basic aspect of the traditional approach. From that perspective or from that model, we can understand the making of the foreign policy and implementation of the foreign policy. Friends, another important models that we may make out here is the analytical approach. So, in the traditional approach, institutions and their preferences and national interests are the core to study foreign policy. From the perspective of analytical approach, the assessment part, which means that the formulations, what are the basic objective, the rational choice model, that rationally what kind of issues are selected by the policy makers, how it is implemented, and then the assessment that whether this particular policy or the foreign policy is suitable, giving a positive result or not. So, that critically analyzing the situations that prevail in the international domestic system, how or the process of identification of the national interest, and also the implementation as well as the assessment or the critical analytical part of the implementation and formulation of the foreign policy are the core to study or core subject matter of the study of foreign policy in domestic affairs is concerned. Friends, another models, that is the ideological models, how the faith, ideology and the basic purpose of the states is impacting the formulation of foreign policy is concerned, which means that the ideology means the basic values or the assumptions that the state has over a particular issues that is actually impacting the foreign policy making of a particular state is concerned. So, in that sense, friends, ideology we can refer the ideology of communism, the ideology of contentment of communism, the ideology of capitalism, the contentment of capitalism, and ideology of non-alignment. So, these sort of basic principles, these sort of basic values, and the ideology or the ideas of the nations or the policy makers is actually impacting in the making of the foreign policy vis-a-vis to international system is concerned. Another important dimension or the models to look at or to explain the concept of foreign policy is the comparative approach or comparative models of the making of the foreign policy or the foreign policy of a particular state. Friends, in that sense, the comparative analysis is that there is a comparison of the foreign policy of the different countries. To do so, the foreign policy analysts, they are taking into considerations the various facts, the various statements of the policy makers, as well as the basic facts regarding the implementation and also the formulation of foreign policy of the different state in the international system. And with the help of these tools and techniques, or with the help of certain facts related to the making of the foreign policy and implementation of the foreign policy, the policy analysts, they are just trying to compare the various facts which is there, or the various issues which are there among the various policy making or the foreign policy of different states. So, this is what about the comparative analysis or doing the comparative analysis of the foreign policy of the different state in the international system. So, through that way also we can understand or we can judge the success and the failure, or what are the reasons for the success and the failure of the making and implementation of the foreign policy. So, in that sense, that comparative approach or comparative models is become very important so far as to understand, so far as to analyze the success and failure and the reason of the success and the failure rather more to understand that comparative approach or comparative models is become very important, and that help us to understand the success, reason for the success and the reason for the failure of the foreign policy of a particular country. Another important models or the approach of foreign policy is that the bureaucratic structure and process. Friends, in that sense we can say that the bureaucracy means in the making of the foreign policy there are various institutions, various actors involved in that. One are the political in nature, the political actors, another is the bureaucratic, technocratic actors in the making and implementation of foreign policy. So, in the making of the foreign policy, executive branch of the government, that is the political executive and also the legislatures, member of the legislature, they have the main responsibility in the making of the foreign policy, but at the same time friends, it is the bureaucrat, their experience and their technological know-how, their skills, the bureaucratic skills and for example, the ambassadors who are responsible in the implementation of the foreign policy, their inputs are also very much important so far as the making of the foreign policy is concerned. So, their inputs in the making of the foreign policy and their skills and their activities or the behavior rather in the implementation of the foreign policy of that particular state, being a diplomat of a particular state or the representative of their state of their state, their role is also equally very important so far as to understand or to explain the basic conception of foreign policy formulation and implementation is in world politics is concerned. Friends, another important models or approach in that regard is the cognitive process and the psychological approach, which means that here we find the behavioralistic aspect of the policy makers, why a particular choice or why a particular issues is taken up by the policy makers, why a specific policies are being designed by the policy makers. So, their preferences, their choices is actually reflecting the psychological or the cognitive aspect of that particular policy makers. So, in that sense friends, the psychological, that is the behavioralistic part of the policy makers, their preferences, their choice, why they are making that and how they perceive the things, that is equally important just to know or just to explain the foreign policy of any particular state. The last important models through that we can explain the issue of foreign policy in world politics is the social constructive approach or social constructive models of making foreign policy. As we know friends that we have already discussed about that the constructive approach is talking about more in terms of the preferences of the policy makers, and the preferences of the policy makers are largely dependent on the situation that prevail in the society, that is the idea, basic norms and faith in the society, that is the surroundings or the environment where the policy makers is actually taking any sort of decision. So, friends, in that sense the choices, the preferences or the foreign policy making is not autonomous in nature, rather it is largely confined or limited to the ideas or the values or the faith that prevails in the society, and that ideas, faith and norms of the society is actually controlled by the hegemonic state or hegemonic class in the world system. So, how that impacting the policy making process, how that ideas, belief and the situations that and the norms of the society prevails, and how it is impacting the political choices of the policy makers or the state. So, this is also one of the important aspect to know or to explain the foreign policy determinants or the foreign policy issues in the in world politics or in international system. So, friends, from that way these are the basic models, these are the basic approaches that to help us to explain the basic issues related to foreign policy implementation and foreign policy formulation. So, friends, we are in summary we can say that in conclusion that we have discussed in this particular lecture over foreign policy making or foreign policy in world politics, the issue of foreign policy in world politics, how we can define what is the basic sense of foreign policy or foreign policy formulations and implementations, what are the basic components of foreign policy, determinants of foreign policy, external and domestic determinants of foreign policy, and we also discuss the concept of national interest, how the national interest is very much related or very much important in the discussion of foreign policy and international relations as well. and the various theoretical explanation, the international theories that explain foreign policy, and also the various models to understand, to explain the foreign policy making and foreign policy implementation as well. With that, friends, we end the discussion related to foreign policy in world politics. Thank you very much.